Okay, so the blood sport in transition, 1867 to 1915. What you're looking at here is a print from Harper's Weekly at the end of the Civil War, at the outset of Reconstruction. And of course, that's a member of, actually, it's not the Ku Klux Klan, it's another one of the white supremacist groups. That outfit, they predate the KKK, actually, but how they were harassing Black families. So we're going to talk about Reconstruction, the Grant presidency, the election of 1876, domestic terrorism, which is aptly portrayed in that print, Woodrow Wilson, and finally the decline of voter participation. So Reconstruction, this was, the post-Civil War plans to rebuild the United States and to get it in a better place than it was before the Civil War. Thomas Nast, the nation's most famous cartoonist, who had emerged actually before the Civil War, and he would give us not only important cartoons about the politics and the Civil War, but also he would be the one who would add to our understanding of the donkey as the symbol for the Democrats, the elephant for the Republicans, and probably most famously, he's the one who created the image of Santa Claus as most of us think of Santa Claus today, but I'm not going to share any of those cartoons. So he drew this cartoon after the Civil War. He's excited by radical Republican plans, and he shows his hopefulness for the future in this Thanksgiving cartoon. Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving dinner, come one, come all, free and equal. And sitting around the table are a wide variety of types of people from around the world. Very hopeful. And on the wall are hanging Lincoln, George Washington, and to the right, Ulysses S. Grant, who had just taken office when this cartoon appears. Why he was so excited, there were a number of reasons. First of all, the so-called Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th amendments, which are passed. Of course, if you've seen the Lincoln film, which I hope you have, that's all about the passage of the 13th Amendment. While Lincoln was still alive, he didn't unfortunately get to see the 14th and 15th passed, although they were already in the planning stages when he was assassinated. And these, of course, end slavery, make freedmen citizens of the United States, and gives them the right to vote. The Freedmen's Bureau is created, and it is a means for integrating freedmen, former slaves, into society. So there are education programs for the young. There are job programs for those who don't want to continue to work in the South on cotton plantations, although most end up getting stuck there or as sharecroppers, unfortunately. But it was an attempt at promoting social equality of sorts. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which I'll cover in the next slide, which was essentially the radical program. The Amnesty Act of 1872, which is going to bring the South back into the Union. A very important part of the process if you're going to actually get reunification. Excuse me. And then a Civil Rights Act of 1875, which essentially codifies in law the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The step-by-step plan entailed, and this is the radical plan. I should pause here and say, okay, the Republican Party is divided into several factions, but the two main factions are the mainstream Republicans, for lack of any other better name for calling them that. These are pro-business, typical Republicans of the 19th century, who are focused on free enterprise, business expansion, and raising people up through work. They were not focused on civil rights. The radical Republicans is the wing that focused on civil rights. And although they're the minority in the party, they're driving the show from the middle of the Civil War right through until the collapse of the Reconstruction plan. And why the mainstream Republicans are going to get enticed is because of, you know, the voting bloc that the freedmen would offer them. The South was, so here's the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. The South was divided into 5 military districts and governed by military governors. These are former generals, Union generals, until accepted state constitutions could be written and approved by Congress. So there was a lengthy process here. And what Grant did once he was in office was make sure that in those 5 military districts, as they were starting to get resistance, he sent down the USCTs, the US colored troops, who had been formed mid-war, to play a key role in enforcing the law. And of course, that just rubs salt into the wound of the Southerners, and Grant and the radicals have no problem with doing that. All males, regardless of race, but excluding former Confederate leaders. This would be top generals and members of the Confederate Congress, were permitted to participate in the constitutional conventions that formed the new governments in each state. The new state constitutions were required to provide for universal manhood suffrage, regardless of race. No talk of women's suffrage at this point. And I could pause here again and say that much to the chagrin of women who had worked hard to secure the right to vote for the freedmen, A, because they were abolitionists, but B, because they expected really, that they would ride in on the coattails of universal manhood suffrage and get female suffrage as well. Those hopes would be crushed. States were required to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to be readmitted to the Union. And of course, that means making Black people citizens of the United States and of their states. And that's a tough one for white supremacists, of course, to swallow. And again, that's what the radicals and Grant want. But there was a problem. Not just Nathan Bedford Forrest, but other men like him. Nathan Bedford Forrest is a infamous Confederate general, speaking strictly militarily, and I don't know if Bob Krickenberger is with me tonight. He may not be. Forrest was absolutely one of the most ferocious and in some ways successful Confederate generals, absolutely notorious, and did some very bad things, which we do not have time to discuss. Maybe someday we'll do a Civil War course, but after the war, he hated Black people. I mean, that's not an understatement. After the war, he became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan for the first couple of years. He'll actually quit the Klan because he felt that they weren't doing a good enough job for what they were expected to do. So that kind of tells you a lot about Forrest himself. Nass drew this cartoon. This is a white man's government when he begins to see what is happening in the South after that hopeful 69 cartoon, and how different factions within the United States were making the freedmen's attempt to vote difficult. That is a former or a Union soldier reaching for the ballot box. That lower right-hand corner, the ballot box, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on tonight. That's what the ballot boxes looked like. It was actually like a fishbowl, and you could see right into it every ballot that was dropped in there, and that was for a reason, which again we'll talk about. But notice the people in this cartoon, two of the three. On the left-hand side is a very crude, gross drawing, a caricature of an Irishman. Nast was not kind to the Irish, shared that prejudice that many Americans did at this time. And so Irish with Nast cartoon always looked like a monkey, a gorilla. And that's a caricature of Nathan Bedford Forrest in the middle. Andrew Johnson was still president when the '67 military reconstruction bill was passed. He will veto that bill. The veto will be overridden. But in response to the veto, Nast drew these two cartoons, actually drew four cartoons, but these are two of them, attacking Johnson, Southern justice on the left. And you can see so-called justice, which is a nasty Greek god, not god, but Medusa.
Medusa.
Thank you. And you have the imbalance in the, I'm drawing a blank here, but in the scales. And of course, it's weighed down by Southern gentlemen, and the Yankee and the freedmen are nowhere to be seen on that scale of justice. And of course, on the right, if he is a Union man or a freedman, you hang him. What was emerging immediately after the war becomes known as the lost cause. And the lost cause is alive and well today, unfortunately. Edward Pollard, his book appears almost immediately after the war and is a bestseller in the South. And there was obviously genuine interest to reunify the United States for obvious reasons, but not because of what becomes known as the lost cause. What Pollard and others will argue as apologists is that the real reason for the war is lost to the public, that they don't understand why the war was fought. Here's an excerpt to give you a taste of it. During the war, slavery was used as a catchword to arouse this is Pollard, arouse the passions of a fanatical mob. And to some extent, the prejudices of the civilized world were excited against us. But the war was not made on our part for slavery. The conditions of domestic slavery as it existed in the South had not only resulted in a great improvement in the moral and physical condition of the Negro race, but had furnished a class of laborers as happy and contented as any in the world, if not more so. Nevertheless, the struggle made by the people of the South was not for the institution of slavery, but for the inestimable right of self-government against the domination of a fanatical faction at the North. And that is the crux of the lost cause argument. And as I said, wildly popular in the South. So Ulysses S. Grant is elected president of the United States, former successful leader of Union forces that leads to the defeat of Lee and his Virginia Army. He had two slogans: vote as you shot, obviously addressing the Union veterans, but let us have peace. Ulysses S. Grant genuinely wants to reunite the the states, but in a way that would have staying, lasting power, but at the same time achieve equality for the freedmen. I have to pause here and say that I think Ulysses S. Grant has gotten a bad rap throughout most of our history. And the reason I sent you a link to a book review of Chernow's biography of Grant, which I strongly recommend if you're not afraid of reading thick books. I think it's better than his Hamilton biography, to be honest. But I don't think they'll ever be doing a Broadway musical of Grant. He was judged harshly, first by the South, who hated him because A, he wins the war, and B, because of what actions he will take as president against the South. And they will spread all kinds of ideas and rumors and lies that will take hold. And when I was educated in college and early grad school, the 60s professors who were, filled with all of the events that were going on with the Vietnam War and with the civil rights movement before it and after the war, actually, did not take a kind lens to Grant either. And it's only, and unfairly, to be honest. And it's only been in the last 10 years or so that Grant is now being, I think, fairly judged. Certainly not a perfect president, made mistakes, as all of our presidents have, of course, some more than others. He's at worst a middling president, and I put him a little bit above middle. And needs to be praised for what he will do for Reconstruction. So he signed laws providing freedmen with equal rights. Remember, Andrew Johnson, his predecessor, had no interest in doing any of that. He enforces Reconstruction. When he sees what the South is doing with the Klan and other acts of terror, and taking actions to subvert voting through intimidation, he has Congress pass what officially is called the Force Act. It's not the first Force Act that a president had passed. Andrew Jackson had done the first Force Act, and it becomes known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. And he sends more troops into the South to oversee voting and to get local officials to live up to the Constitution. So he puts teeth into the laws. And what he does is, to a great degree, successful while he's in office. We talked a little bit about Indians last time. There was a question about that. He does attempt to implement what he called a peace plan for the Indians, but it goes nowhere. There was just too much interest in land grabs and getting the Indian out of the way. He never stood a chance with this one. He was plagued by scandals within his administration. None of the scandals tainted him, other than the fact that these were people that he had appointed. He was not involved. He did not gain anything from them. At worst, I guess you can say he was a poor judge of character in choosing some of the people he did. Nonetheless, they were notorious scandals. And then in his second term, the Panic of 1873 hits, mostly because of some conniving robber barons who were trying to corner the silver market, and it forced a collapse of the New York Stock Exchange. And he was president, and when bad things happen during your presidency, you get blamed whether it's your fault or not. And it was a bad panic. A current professor who just wrote a book not too long ago, not Chernow, but another person who is discussing Grant. This is a quote from his book. The true task of the just policymaker during the years following Appomattox was to achieve a balance between restoration, readjustment, and revolution. And Grant, perhaps more than his contemporaries, understood the problem and tried to deal with it. So remember last time we talked about Pig Iron Kelly, a Philadelphia congressman, activist for Black suffrage. He hasn't gone away. Remember, he's around in Congress till the 1890s. Well, he reappears here in this set of slides. By the late 1860s, the Northern Republican Party was ready to consider enfranchising all male citizens, at least. In the years right after the war, many Northern states introduced referenda to give the vote to their Black residents. White voters rejected them all, except in Iowa and Minnesota, states with tiny African American populations. Clearly, even Northern Republicans were deeply skeptical of Black voters in their own states. Kelly denounces his own party for, quote, denying the humanity of the great mass of mankind, end quote, by ignoring calls for Black voting rights. But after 1868, when Ulysses S. Grant won the presidency because of Southern Black voters, the Republican Party embraced the cause, especially in states with larger Black populations like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Suddenly, Kelly's wild calls for Black voting rights seemed like more than earnest idealism. They made good partisan sense. So Grant serves his 2 terms. In 1876, he flirts with the idea of a 3rd term. Of course, George Washington had set the precedent, although no constitutional restrictions yet, for the idea that you only should run for 2 terms. So Grant, was up against a strong precedence, and most Republicans said no. You can't have a 3rd term. So they will nominate Hayes, who was a Civil War officer, fought in the war, actually with some distinction. And his Democratic counterpart was Governor of New York, Samuel Tilden. In the election of 1876, in the outcome, you can see where the Democratic forces are focused, which is predominantly in the South, no surprise. And the reason there are Southern states that are Republican is because in 76, there are still Blacks voting easily. I don't know if easily is the right word, but we're voting in Louisiana, Florida, in particular, South Carolina to some degree. So the Democrats will not be able to win those 3 states. In the outcome, the Electoral College there's no winner. Hayes gets 185, Tilden gets 184. So because of the Electoral College, no one wins. In the states, Hayes wins 21, Tilden 17. And in the popular vote, here we go again, Tilden, the loser in the Electoral College, although not really, since there is no clear winner, is the winner in the popular vote. It goes to the House, like we've talked about before, and they can't come to any kind of decision. And they're working right up to Inauguration Day. And inauguration in those days, before the Constitution is amended, was in March. So what they do is they're going to hold an electoral commission. It's a 15-member electoral commission. The extra person is a Republican, so the Republicans have the upper hand in this commission, and they have to figure out how to get through this, because you got to have a nominee by the time of inauguration, or a winner, I should say. And they come up with the Compromise of 1877. Here's the deal. The removal of all remaining U.S. military forces from the former Confederate states. At the time, U.S. troops remained only in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, but the compromise completed their withdrawal from the region. And those are the 3 states, of course, that the Democrats had failed to secure in the election. The appointment of at least one Southern Democrat to Hayes's cabinet. The construction of another transcontinental railroad using the Texas and Pacific Railroad lines that already existed in the South. Legislation to help industrialize the South and restore its economy following Civil War and Reconstruction. And then the next point is the key. The right of the South to deal with Black people however they pleased and without Northern interference. So essentially what this does is it ends Reconstruction. Another Nast cartoon showing how, in his opinion, the South won the day with the gun and the whip in the South against the Black vote, which is now going to be suppressed. And this is the price that the Republicans are willing to pay in order to keep the White House. What happens is the majority Republican faction, the business faction, as I call them, they're done with all of the fighting that's going on in the South. They're discouraged. They don't believe that they're going to be able to secure a peaceful acceptance of the Black voter in the South. And at this point, because of the panic of 1873, they want to get on with the business of business. And so they shrug their shoulders and say, it's time to move on. And so they push aside the radical complaints and things go back to normal. Violence continues unabated. And you'll notice now that some of the violence that and again, this is a selective list. There are plenty other things, but not enough screens to fill them all. So 1877, the Great Railroad Strike, which is actually a series of strikes in Baltimore, Chicago, Philadelphia, Reading, St. Louis, and actually some other places too. What's emerging here is another new piece, and that is labor strife. Unionism is now on the ticket. And people are pushing against the robber barons and the pro-business Republicans, saying unions must be accepted. And of course, this is going to resort to violence because the Republican Party, particularly in the industrial North, where unionism is strong, not in the South, obviously, the Republican Party controls the police forces. It controls the state militias because, predominantly the northern states are controlled all by Republican Party. So it's going to be a series of brutal fights. In San Francisco, there's an anti-Chinese riot. Greenwood, New York, and this has nothing to do with race, color, but it doesn't have to do really with the labor, but the railroad construction. They were acquiring lands, taking the right of public domain, and so the local residents took up arms actually against this. It was actually a bloody insurrection. Cincinnati, Ohio courthouse riot, again, has nothing to do with race, but what happened was, again, the elites who controlled the Justice Department in the state of Ohio and Cincinnati in particular, ruled when they controlled the jury, and they ruled against a murder conviction, and the local public were so incensed that they had a very bloody riot for Cincinnati and caused 50 deaths. One of the most deadly ever on this topic. Rock Springs, Wyoming, just drove through there not too long ago. A massacre of Chinese laborers. If you know anything about Wyoming, you'd wonder why the Chinese were there, but it was essentially because of the railroads. Seattle anti-Chinese riot. The Haymarket Square, interesting event. This is Chicago. This is again a labor riot. In this case, the anarchists. There were real anarchists back then, and one of them threw a bomb, and the labor movement got blamed for it, and a lot of police brutality, oppression, arrests. There were executions. The Haymarket Square riot is one of the most notorious labor events in our 19th century history. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a labor strike for an 8-hour day ended in deaths. The Thibodaux massacre, race riot in Louisiana. What was happening, of course, once Reconstruction is over is you not only have the Klan and other white supremacist organizations running freely around the South, but you had white paramilitary groups who marched like militias, even though they were not officially militias, and they enforced what they considered to be the laws of the land. Hennessy affair, put this because it's interesting, lynching of 11 Italians by white paramilitary group in New Orleans. So it's not only blacks they're going after anybody who's Catholic in the South, and you know, they hung 11 Italians. I researched this for really no reason. And Homestead Steel Strike, of course, in Pittsburgh area, one of the bloodiest, notorious steel strikes of this time period too, against, again, labor. But back home in Philadelphia, Philadelphia may have been 4.5% African American in 1870, but it was 27% foreign born, many of them impoverished Irish Catholic immigrants who faced their own struggles. It had not been that long since 1844 when nativist Protestant rioters attacked Irish neighborhoods, murdering dozens and burning cathedrals. To this persecuted ethnic minority, often made up of day laborers and domestic servants living in Philly's dingiest alleys, the Democratic Party looked like a rare ally. By the 1870s, a tribal political machine ran many of Philadelphia's poorer wards, led by the canny American-born sons of famine immigrants. Like Philadelphia's African-American Republicans, Irish Democrats saw a political party as one of the few institutions that could help overcome ethnic discrimination and Gilded Age capitalism. And like the Washington politicos, who made up for lack of social standing with pure aggression, these hard-driving campaigners replaced the old aristocrats who wanted little to do with men like William McMullen. Before he became Democratic boss of the 4th Ward in Philadelphia, McMullen was just another South Philly troublemaker, a thick-necked gang leader with a chin-patch beard and a pitiless stare. But before that, he was a scared child of Irish immigrants, growing up in back alley slum at 7th and Bainbridge. By 17, McMullen had fought to defend his neighborhood in the 1844 anti-immigrant riots, but also participated in the racist pogroms that targeted nearby African Americans. McMullen survived all this violence unscathed, giving rise to the rumors that guns mysteriously jammed when fired at his chest because Mullen was, quote, protected by the evil one, end quote. Protected or not, by the time he reached voting age, McMullen had formed an embattled belief that life meant war for his tribe against Protestants above and African Americans below. He entered adulthood as a crude bully, but also as a shrewd leader, simultaneously the voice of one of the nation's most targeted immigrant communities and also the ringleader of one of country's most violent white supremacist movements. His motto, always get even, summed up his worldview. So I gave you this editorial to read. Is democracy a failure? Just in case you didn't read it, here's an excerpt. Because it's, you know, by 1876, this is obviously a valid question. It may strike the reader as a quibble, as an absurdity, or as a falsehood, should we, in your refutation of this principle of absolutism and oligarchy, ask at this time of day if the United States of North America have really at any time actually constituted a Republican government. We have been so accustomed to hear from infancy eulogies of the wisdom which shaped our Constitution, praises of its perfection, hymns of to its symmetry and strength, that to doubt its fullness of all excellence has come to sound like sacrilege. Yet after all, we may now, in these days of disunion and terror, venture to ask if our government has, after all, ever been a republic. What is more expressive of political and social unity than one law for a people? The same for everyone bearing the same national name. Yet, we have laws as different in our states as in the various countries of Europe. I find that still to be poignant. Kelly's still with us. Kelly by now is seen as because the mainstream Republicans are back in charge, Kelly is a thorn in their side. And Nast agrees. This is a Nast cartoon showing Kelly with a jack in the box with some crazy, rabid, wild, crazy looking radical. Iron and blood, this don't scare worth a cent. In 1877, New York merchants, bankers, industrialists, and other elites met at Chickering Hall in Manhattan for a meeting of taxpayers. They were proposing an amendment to the New York State Constitution that set out to limit universal male suffrage in municipal elections. This would disenfranchise approximately half of the city's legal voters in all city elections. Such anti-democratic proposals were not uncommon in the polarized urban politics of the Gilded Age, and was specifically designed to reduce the political power of the working class. William Kelly remained radical after 1876 and was drawn towards the causes of the laboring class and paper money, which was seen as a very radical idea, and the Republicans hated this. They want to stay on the gold standard. Earning the wrath of mainstream Republicans in the wake of the Panic of 1873. So Kelly doesn't go away. And of course, at the height of the Gilded Age, this is all about urban bosses and the political machine. And they ruled the urban centers of the United States. And of course, the key was to get out the vote. And so the machine, of course, is a metaphor for the organization. And it was a highly well-designed, well-oiled machine to get out the vote, starting at the lowest level, which every block in every city from Philadelphia, New York City, and onward had a block captain. And then block captains reported to ward bosses. And then the ward bosses reported to the county bosses, and then to the ultimate party boss himself. Of course, Boss Tweed, who's pictured with his thumb on the right, is the most notorious, but there were plenty others who were absolutely just as notorious. It's just because Nast made him famous that he gets the #1 slot. And of course, what the bosses were doing was staying in power by giving out jobs, Christmas turkeys, and help from those who were hungry, who had lost a job, or whose tenement house had burned down. And the irony here is, of course, the Republicans want nothing to do with any of this lower echelon people. And the bosses step in, and of course they're buying votes, but they're also providing help to people who otherwise wouldn't get any help. So it's a real paradox, a real dichotomy here, the role of the machine in the Gilded Age. Voter turnout was crucial for the political machine. The more voters they encouraged to vote, the easier it was for the political machine to remain in power. So, and another way to put this is, the higher the turnout, the easier it was for them to win. So turnout was key here. And of course, this is the loudest and roughest political campaigns in US history during this time period, from the Civil War to 1912. The era was marked by our highest voter turnouts ever in presidential elections. Keep that in mind here. Presidential elections continued to be decided by close margins. Produced the most prolonged period of political violence in our history. Racist terrorism in the South, brutal suppression of the labor movement throughout the industrial North and Midwest. There were 3 presidential assassinations, Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. You had 1 impeachment, of course, that was Johnson. You had 2 presidential elections, one by the loser. And control of Congress was unstable, meaning that it flip-flopped back and forth by, again, close margins, just like the presidential elections. So there was no stability in Washington, D.C. in order to get a lot done. Tribal partisanship remained strong because of racial, ethnic, and religious identities. Think of what I just read about the ward boss McMullen in Philadelphia and his attitude, and that was the approach of many, many people, and why this was such a rough and tumble, dangerous, violent time period. Here's an interesting perspective, political cartoon. Magazines are coming of age now because of the design of the press had changed into a lithographic design, so they could use metal plates and engravings and incorporate color. So there were 2 very famous magazines, Judge and Puck. Judge was the Democratic base magazine, and Puck was for Republicans. So massive political participation made it more difficult to tackle problems and inequities. Now, this is what a historian is saying. This is what a political scientist is saying today. They weren't this was not something that anyone really thought of back in the 1880s. This cartoon with George and Ben is entitled 1889 to 1789, The Progress of Time. And of course, on the left is a riffraff of bosses and robber barons and the like, businessmen. And it's a commentary on how maybe we've stepped back.
Well, okay.
The last gasp of 19th century populism. Cartoon on the right. Please, you've got your, please mute yourself.
What context is it?
So we've got William McKinley, the president, when this cartoon was drawn, in the pocket of the.
Oh, you trying to put something up?
Please mute yourself.
The
And a party boss there who's allegedly running McKinley. And these are farmers who are
Did you Google
drowning.
it? Google lip of a rack. And it might show you
Are
what
drowning.
that looks like. Like is it the front part of the rack? Is it the back? You know what I mean?
Who are drowning in poverty.
But hold on.
There's a bitter
I've never heard
divide.
that terminology, not that that means anything. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm like, okay.
I don't know who's talking to some other people. Would
Grace
you please,
Parker?
Would you please mute yourselves? I apologize, everybody, but there's nothing I can do about it. There's a bitter divide between the urban and rural sectors.
Oh, okay. I'm looking at it down too. Okay.
Excuse me 1 second, people.
Yes. Well, why didn't they just put that? You know what I mean?
Can I mute this?
You know what? That's what I'm determined. I'm determined.
See, that's why you got to go to IKEA because they give you pictures. See, IKEA give you pictures. If you can't figure it out, you just follow the pictures.
Sorry, I can't mute them. I might try to. Okay, so
See,
a bitter
learn
divide
something new tonight.
between the urban and rural sectors. They demanded that silver coinage be added to the gold standard. This is the populace.
Oh, see,
We talked
you just
about
got
the
it, you know
last
what I
time.
mean?
They wanted a graduated income tax.
Because when I heard you stop, I said, did she see something? Is she stopping it out the way?
Grace Parker.
Grace Parker, mute
You didn't
yourself.
see my text message?
Grace Parker.
I sent you a text message.
Grace
and I said,
Parker, mute yourself.
Parker.
are you
Now.
okay? I heard you stopping. And I said,
Grace
did she see
Parker.
something?
Where is she? I can't even find her.
She's right here. Oh, I'm sorry. There is a way.
Oh,
you can
okay.
mute.
Okay.
Parker, please mute.
If you go on her, she's right. I don't know how to explain it, but
She has a stack of books.
Okay.
I can't mute her anyway. I don't have that control. I apologize, people.
Can you remove someone from the Zoom room?
What is the male, what is the
controls the
female?
meeting.
Yes, they tell you all that.
Poor Grace. She doesn't know
Yeah.
she's doing
All
this.
right. All right. Bye.
Bye, Grace.
Bye.
Jeez.
Jesus.
I apologize. I'm going to go a little longer. Let me back up to this slide. So we were talking about the change, which wasn't change. Maybe it was regression, and people starting to feel that way by the 1880s. And the populists are going to take one last shot at this in the famous election of 1896 and tried to bring about reform. This is a rural movement. There's a bitter divide between the urban and rural sectors by now, between the Industrial Revolution and the middle class, who are part of that as the management level, and the farmers, because in 1896, the vast majority of Americans is still rural, not urban. That it won't be until the 1920 census that for the first time we'll have more urban than rural people. They demanded that silver coinage be added to the gold standard. What this is going to do is inflate the monetary system, which is what they wanted. Money was too expensive. Farmer could not get loans, and so they wanted to have more access to more loans, so that they could buy the new equipment, which is coming out, the threshing machine, for instance, to buy more land, or to just buy what they needed for the next set of crops. They wanted a graduated income tax. They said, why shouldn't people who make more money pay more tax than me, the farmer, who's making so much less? They demanded fair regulation of railroads and telegraphs. As it turns out, the industrialists were cutting sweetheart deals with the railroads and the telegraphs machines, and paying less than what a farmer would just to get his goods from rural Kansas to Kansas City, as opposed to Sinclair, who's shipping oil from California to wherever. They expected a fair enforcement of the Homestead Act. Again, people were pushing ahead in the line and being able to buy land easier than other people like farmers. Promoted the implementation of initiative and recall. This is probably the most radical idea for them. This was the idea that citizens could actually initiate the discussion for legislation and get it considered in your state houses, and also recall, which of course means attempt to remove somebody from office.
We had that.
They demanded direct election of the president and the senators. Senators were still not directly elected. Senators were chosen by the state legislatures. So that means if a party is, one party controls the state, Democrat or Republican, but in many cases Republican at this time, then they're just going to choose, obviously, Republican senators. And often cronies and people who weren't really suited to be representatives of their constituents. And of course, you have the Electoral College with the president. They called for unemployed to be hired for public works during the downtimes, like the Panic of 1873. Why not put them to work with federal money that would improve something, but also put them to work so that they could pay their bills and keep the economy going? and they demanded spelling error, sorry. It was a last minute change of words and I didn't proofread. Implementation is supposed to be of the secret ballot, and this is the big one. William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president 3 times, 1896 being the most famous one, a quote, he was a Democrat. Nearly all of our controversies and combats grow out of the fact that we are trying to get something from each other. There will be peace when our aim is to do something for each other. The populace will lose, but somebody's going to step in to their place, a new party that's going to call themselves the Progressive Party. Not the same as progressives today, although there are some similarities. There's a cartoon portraying the progressives on the left who want to bust the trusts, break up the monopolies, go after the bosses. Labor was worried about that. So the progressives moved away from the rural base, and that's a key. They're going to look to the cities as opposed to the populace. The new party was led by urban-focused professionals. Many of the new progressives had gone to college and had a new degree called political science, which was just beginning in those times. They want to smash the political machine. They see that as the root of all evil. And if they could just destroy the machine, then they could get through reform and improve democracy. They continued to pursue the populist platform of 1896, however. They'll join with Democrats to help elect Woodrow Wilson in 1912. So the game changer. Here's a Puck cartoon, the American invention for blowing up bosses. And what is it? It's to get rid of the old ballot. How voting worked before the secret ballot, which is at that time known as the Australian ballot, because Australia adopts it first, is that they had this fishbowl. And so the political parties colluded together. And so I'm making this up, but say in Kansas, the Democrats would say, okay, we'll make our ballot green. And the Republicans would say, we'll make ours red. So when you go to vote and you drop the ticket, because you didn't do ticket splitting yet, you voted one party or the other, you would drop your ballot in the bowl and everybody knew if you were voting for a Democrat or Republican. So then the reformers try to get around that by saying you must use a white ballot. So what do the parties do? They agree, okay, you use a white and we'll use a cream color. And so finally, what's going to work is the secret ballot. Individual states adopted secret ballots between 1884 and 1891. Something you have to remember, and that includes in a discussion of anything that's going on today, that the federal government has very little to do with the electoral process. It's the states that run the elections, and each state can have its own separate laws. And you know, it was good then because they're adopting secret ballots. Today, I think we have some concerns. The secret ballot disrupted the vote buying because candidates were uncertain how a citizen actually voted. Here's a quote from the Times. The powerless will always be prevailed upon by the powerful. Only secrecy can protect them from bribery and bullying. The secret ballot ended the Gilded Age. Reformers broke the system. Here's a photograph of women who now are getting the right to vote, first at the state level, and then in 1920, of course, at the national level. And voting machines were actually invented early on here. They're an early invention, so it wasn't long before they get rid of the ballot completely. American politics was transformed from public passion to private, independent, and restrained voting patterns. Big switch from the last 100 years or so. Founders were replaced by restrainers. Noisy politics had to be quieted in order for the reformers to succeed. The new politicos had learned that high engagement can enrage, but interferes with their ability to legislate. Although new voters were being added, voter participation began to recede. And that's the paradox. The booming economy offers up free time for new activities. Public education was becoming universal and college was now more accessible, meaning that more people were getting trained for more and different jobs, and also with more interests, and literacy rates are way up. Public parks and libraries were appearing in more cities and towns. Factories created intramural sports teams. Professional baseball, now beginning, found a hungry ticket-buying public. And here's a big one. The women's club movement developed and was affecting social change in urban and rural America. These are photographs of a colored women voters, women's group up top. And at the bottom, it's an Oklahoma group, a women's club. And they were very active in trying to downplay violence, to promote private voting, and to promote public discussion of other topics other than politics. And so the public mood is changing, and that has a dramatic impact on all of this and helps to explain why there's going to be such a decrease in public violent politics. And then we're now the nation's finally becoming national. There's national newspapers and magazines that are printed wherever and read from the West Coast to the East Coast. And that too is going to play an important part here in changing perceptions and help unite the people in a more focused way and look less towards parochial, rural, or urban or state concerns. Mr. Wilson, as I mentioned before, is elected in 1912, and he'll serve 2 terms. He pleased the progressives in his first term. He got a graduated income tax passed. The tariff was lowered, aiding rural America. Remember, tariffs are on taxes on imported goods. Federal Reserve System is created, which is a new central banking system, the first we'd had since Alexander Hamilton, after Jackson had killed it. The Federal Trade Commission, which is a new watchdog for consumers, still around today, of course, and a new antitrust law, which helps to begin to weaken monopolies. And loans to farmers were now easier to obtain. But progressives turn against Wilson for some pretty obvious reasons. Here's a cartoon from a St. Louis Dispatch, actually. Mr. President, why not make America safe for democracy? There was a huge race riot in St. Louis during his, well, there were many. So first Southerner elected since 1848 and the first Democrat since 1860. He reinforced segregation policies within all federal agencies. Labor and race relations further eroded under Wilson with a revival of the Ku Klux Klan and an increase in lynchings during his time. War clouds were on the horizon despite his re-election campaign proclaiming he kept us out of war. So second term doesn't work out like the first term. Wilson was the lost cause president. If you remember last time, Bob Kirkenberger talked about Indians involved in the Confederate Army. Here is a photograph of Cherokee Indians at a Confederate reunion, and just as a reminder. So in June 1917, the United Confederate Veterans hosted their 27th reunion in Washington, D.C., the first such reunion outside the former Confederacy. As the Confederate veterans marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to the tune of Dixie, Wilson was in the grandstands waving them by. A veterans newsletter described the scene as, quote, "The men who made history half a century ago saluted the man who is making history today and who stands for the principles for which they gave their lives. He attended a banquet that night, and this is reported. There are many memories, these are Wilson's words. There are many memories of the Civil War that thrill along the blood and make one proud to have been sprung of a race that could produce such bravery and constancy. To a standing ovation of applause and rebel yells, Wilson warmly recalled how, quote, heroic things were done on both sides. That kind of has a ring to it. America was leaving the 19th century politics behind. Cartoon on the right shows an undesirable immigrant, and the United States is about to shut the gates to immigration. Party-led government was not a means for settling things. It was best of devices for keeping them unsettled. To save democracy, reformers decided you had to restrain it. Interesting concept. Jim Crow laws in the South restricted voting, and the North let it happen. Many white voters became disengaged with politics, joining more social groups instead of political parties. Voter participation continued its decline. So take a look at these numbers quickly, and then I'll shut up. So 1848, 72% participation. 1856, almost 80%. 1860, the Civil War election, 81%, 79%, all the way down. The last in that column, 1884 is 78% almost. 1888 in the right-hand column, 79%. And then you look, then it begins to drop in 1900, in 1904, and on down. 1912, when Wilson's elected, less than 60%. And then in 20, we're under 50% from then on, really. I'll give you some more stats of more recent election participation, but I'll save that for next time. Next time. Do we misunderstand our own history? Do we have an imperial presidency problem? Does history recycle itself? What did we learn? Where do we go from here? These are things I'd like you to think about, and I think that we should talk about next time. I'll send out a short reading to address some of this, to give you some ideas and things to chew on. I particularly like that cartoon. Mike Lukovich is a current cartoonist still. So I gave you this cartoon, and I guess at this point we'll throw it open. I think it's kind of obvious what this cartoon's all about. I'll shut up and let some people ask a few questions. So sorry for that interruption. However that happened, I don't know. But hopefully, we kept a line of thinking going here. So does anyone have any questions? Go ahead, Doc. You always are my icebreaker.
So what were the most influential newspapers of the, with a national kind of influence? I assume the New York Times would be one.
The New York World becomes one of the big ones. What's going to happen here at the end of the Gilded Age is Pulitzer and Hearst are going to come along. And so the Pulitzer and Hearst papers are going to be the two big ones, covering both coasts, and they will have a huge impact. If we were going to look at the Spanish-American War, for instance, the Spanish-American War in part is drummed up by the papers, who are going to print all these falsehoods about what was going on in Cuba when it wasn't really going on. And that it will acquire the name the Yellow Press. So again, there's nothing new here. So, you have journalism that is irresponsible, not balanced, not truthful. They were out to sell papers. And So however they could get their readership and what they could convince them with, better. And and on a different note, at the same time, this is when the funnies come out, because it's something that was popular. So they'll start putting the funnies into newspapers because it sold newspapers, the comic strips.
Was there like a level? Well, I guess there was. I mean, the different parts of the population. For example, I mean, was the New York Times then, as it pretty much is now, appealing to the educated? Whereas
Absolutely.
maybe the Hearst newspapers were not.
Well, no, I think they all were appealing to the educated, but they had their audiences, and the New York Times is not being read in Kansas.
Okay,
for
so
instance.
it's not really a national.
No, but
Okay.
with the advent of the transcontinental railroads, papers are going to get from the East Coast to the West Coast, and the telegraph, the newspaper, the railroads are the three top nationalizing influences in the United States, which over time will produce important change.
Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Doc. Anybody else?
Kendall, it's Greg Sampson.
Hi, Greg.
You mentioned right after the, I think it was the 15th Amendment, that you said someone crushed female suffrage at that point, because it would have seemed logical that it would have followed or been a part of all that. Can you spend 30 seconds elaborating what happened there?
Sure. It's Congress that crushes it. There is no interest in extending the suffrage to women at this time. Only a minority group, a small number of people, I should say, are in favor of that. The women had pushed hard. Again, they were a key part to the whole abolitionist movement before the war and throughout the war. And they just kind of assumed that, it would evolve and they would get the right to vote as the freedmen were. So they were surprised. They didn't see it coming. But what they hadn't done, and I don't know that they could have, was build a strong enough coalition within Congress itself. There weren't enough votes in the House and the Senate to give them. I mean, the thought of, you've seen the movies and Downton Abbey and all the rest of it. I mean, just male-dominated system, and it was assumed that most women, A, were not interested in politics, and B, didn't have a strong enough constitution and mind to dabble in those affairs, which of course is absurd. But I mean, it's a pretty simplistic answer. There just wasn't support for it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I have a question that's related, actually. Your last slide kind of answered what I was going to ask, which was what were the voter participation rates? But it was interesting to me to see how voter participation started to decline just as the franchise was expanding in the country. And obviously there's a greater denominator in that case, but do you have any thoughts on that, Kendall?
I didn't have time, or I was going to actually show the 1920 vote. It's shocking. It's the first time women are voting at the national level, and the voter turnout is barely 50%. And you would think, how could that be when you're throwing in so many more new voters? Now, we don't have a breakdown of statistics yet. That's coming, but really isn't going to happen until the 30s, where we get to know more clearly who all's voting. But the assumption that political historians of that time period make is that a lot of women didn't vote yet because they were being restrained by their husbands in part, or because they actually believed, this isn't, what I'm supposed to be doing. I have no interest in that. And that it's going to take some time to educate, the female voter. and also men disgusted at females voting, and others just totally disinterested in what's going on, because this is the Roaring 20s. I mean, as you know, as they become nicknamed, and so the focus is on business, and as long as business is booming and speculation, you know, why mess with things? Just ignore it. And of course, we do have a history in this country of time periods where things are going well and people become disinterested in politics. And I think one of the paradoxes of this that's come out of this course for me is how voter participation at its highest sometimes produces some of the worst things that we can imagine, and we are not successful in getting legislation passed that helps everyone, only a few. You know, I need to think about that and do some more research. I told you it's this one book that's just kind of blown me away to changing my attitudes toward some of this, but it seems to be true. But it's a weak answer, Emily. I'm sorry. It's the best I can give you.
It was a
Kendall,
great.
Mom here has a follow-up on
Hi, Mom.
Emily's question.
Sure.
Do you think there's a correlation between the rise of the single issue voter, if you will, and voter turnout? And that, you know, you sort of end up with human behavior, the paralysis of choice. If people are campaigning on, you know, more than basically 3 issues, people aren't going to know who to vote for, because there's going to be, you know, things they're going to like and dislike on both sides, as opposed to the sort of strong party affiliation that we see now in the strong divide. But where's the rise of the single issue voter in all this?
Well, single issue voter isn't here yet in the time frame I'm covering.
Right.
But the rise, and this is just a personal opinion.
Yep.
To me, the rise of the single issue voter is has an impact. It's not undemocratic, but it has the impact of hurting our democracy. Although right. You have free speech, and of course you have every right to vote only on pro-life, pro-choice, whatever. And I think single issue voting has added to our paralysis over time, over the last 25, 30 years. So again, people have every right to do that. And I don't think we should in any way think we could take that away. We shouldn't, but it has negative influence and negative impact, because if you're only voting for somebody because of their stand on guns or whatever,
or the economy or whatever,
what's to say that they're qualified to be in Washington to represent all their constituents? Right. Or as a senator, you're not just supposed to be representing the state of Kansas. You're supposed to be representing the United States, because that was the intention of the framers, and was that the Senate was going to have a more national scope as opposed to the House, which would be local. But we can see how the Senate is not living up to that these days. But so I think that's an important thing that comes later on. You know, I think after the Vietnam War or during the Vietnam War time period, I would say, although that's not my area of expertise or focus, other than the fact that I lived through it. So good question. Thank you, Sally. One more question.
I've got one if no one else does, but
sure, Matt.
What were Black literacy rates like during this time, and did they read the same newspapers as white people?
Wow, interesting question. I really can't answer you. I know that there is very poor Black literacy because of slavery and the institution, and that was the whole point of the Freedmen's Bureau. So Black literacy rates, obviously for freed Blacks, which is a small population, but in certain areas, like there's one of the largest free Black populations before the Civil War and during the Civil War although that begins to change afterwards, is Philadelphia because of the Quakers. Also in Boston. So, you know, in certain pockets, the literacy rates are, I guess you could say, good, but as a whole, the literacy rates are almost non-existent for a long, long time. And then, of course, what happens is after Reconstruction, the South abandons the reforms, and you get, of course, segregated schools. And we all know what that did. So Black literacy rates, and again, I'm guessing here, because I can't, it's not research I've done, sorry. But I have to assume that they're pretty abysmal for a very long time.
So it probably wouldn't have been economically viable in most of the country to have publications catering to them other than perhaps like, you know, local newsletters or pamphlets. So
there are, well, I do know this, there are Black newspapers that were specific to the Black communities on a much smaller scale. There was one national Black newspaper. The name escapes me, I'm sorry. After a while, I would say by the end of this course, there's a Black national newspaper, but it's small in circulation. But mostly it's just local, regional. But again, literacy rates are still abysmal for a long, long time, sadly.
thanks, that's helpful.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Sorry for that little interruption we got there. Hopefully we got back in focus. And I hope I've been able to present some interesting facts, trends, and get you to think about things. I know I certainly am. And I look forward to next week, where we're going to have a lot more questions and a lot more people who want to talk, I hope. Otherwise, it's going to be a short session. You know, I'll have a brief introduction and a little bit more history, not much, and then introduce Jeff. He's going to speak, and then we're going to open it up and see what we talk about. So thanks for tuning in, and have an excellent rest of the week, and I'll be seeing you.
Thanks.